Two words changed everything. Send them. At 2 a.m. on April 16, 1961, John F. Kennedy authorized the second wave of B-26 airstrikes he had cancelled in our world, and by dawn the anti-aircraft guns of Playa Girón were smoking ruins. The skies over the Bay of Pigs belonged to Brigade 2506, and Fidel Castro had less than 72 hours left in power. In the timeline we know that order never came. Kennedy blinked. The exiles were slaughtered on the sand, and the humiliation propelled the world toward the closest brush with nuclear annihilation in human history. But here, the president does not blink. Here, 16 bombers scream low over the swamps of Zapata, and Castro's tank columns, the same columns that crushed the real invasion, burn on the coastal road before they ever reach the beach. The brigade holds. Understand what that second strike actually did on the ground. In our world, the first air raids on April 15th had left roughly half of Castro's small air force intact, a handful of T-33 jet trainers and Sea Furies that, incredibly, turned the tide. Those planes sank the freighter Rio Escondido, carrying the brigade's spare ammunition and its communications gear, and drove the supply ships back out to sea. The men on the beach ran out of bullets. But in this timeline, the dawn strike on the 16th catches those aircraft on the tarmac at San Antonio de los Baños, wingtips still dripping dew, pilots sprinting across the concrete as the runway erupts. There are no T-33s to climb into the morning sky. The Houston and the Rio Escondido unload their crates without a single strafing run. 1,400 exiles, many of them former Cuban army men, doctors, students, sons of the merchant class, dig in along the sand with mortars fully supplied, and the militia thrown against them by rail and truck arrives piecemeal, exhausted, and, for the first time, without air cover of their own. On the coastal road toward Playa Larga, the burning tanks become a barricade of their own making. Castro, who in reality directed the battle personally from a command post near the Australia sugar mill, finds his reinforcements bottlenecked behind the wreckage, hammered by B-26s that now loiter overhead unchallenged. The smell of scorched diesel and cane fields set alight drifts for miles. And then, the thing the CIA had gambled everything on actually happens. In Havana, the rumor moves faster than the tanks. Castro is trapped. The Americans are coming. This was always the true wager behind Operation Zapata. Not that 1,400 men could conquer an island, but that the sight of an unbroken beachhead would crack the fragile consensus holding the revolution together. And in these 3 days, the crack widens. Middle-class families who had swallowed their doubts about the revolution, the ones who had watched their bank accounts frozen, their sons pulled into the militias, the neighborhood surveillance committees knocking after dark, they hesitate, they calculate, and then they move. Shopkeepers whose stores had been nationalized only months before quietly unlock back rooms where old radios and older rifles have waited. Army officers who had never trusted the young Comandante, men who remembered that the July 26th movement had been one faction among several, begin taking phone calls they would not have taken a week earlier. The regime's grip had always depended on inevitability, on the sense that resistance was futile and the Yankees would never truly come. Playa Girón, still burning and still held, unmakes that spell. In the Escambray Mountains, anti-Castro guerrillas who had been hunted through the winter of 1960 hear the news and come down from the ridges. Sabotage flares in Santa Clara and Cienfuegos. By April 19th, the radio station Castro relied upon, Radio Rebelde, the same transmitter that had carried his voice down from the Sierra in 1958, is silent, its antenna toppled, its announcers vanished into the confusion. In its place, a provisional government under José Miró Cardona, the exile leader the CIA had kept waiting anxiously on a Florida airstrip, is broadcasting from a secured field near the beachhead, calling on the Cuban people and the army to lay down the fight against their own countrymen. Castro himself flees toward the Sierra Maestra, the mountains that once made him a legend, where in 1957 a few dozen ragged survivors of the Granma landing had rebuilt a revolution from nothing. He is retracing the map of his own myth, betting the peasants of Oriente will hide him as they once did. But 1961 is not 1958. This time the mountains do not save him. The roads out of Havana are watched now by men who no longer fear him. The rural cooperatives are grateful for land redistribution, but unwilling to die for a comandante the radio says has already lost. Word of his convoy leaks ahead of it. Within weeks he is gone. Some say to Mexico, some say to Prague, spirited out on a Soviet cargo flight before the airfields fully close, and the man who had promised to remake the hemisphere becomes a guest in someone else's guest house. A footnote giving interviews that fewer and fewer reporters request. Che Guevara, wounded in the fighting near Pinar del Rio where he commanded the western defenses, slips out through the Escambray with a bullet in his shoulder and a fever rising. There is no Ministry of Industry for him now. No bearded icon on 100 million t-shirts. No photograph that becomes the most reproduced image of the 20th century. Instead, there is a long exile, Congo, then Bolivia, the same restless search for a revolution to lead, but with no Havana behind him to fund it, no Cuban intelligence network to smooth the way. It will end, years later, alone in a Bolivian ravine, unremembered, the death of a man the world never learned to recognize. And this is where a single beach begins to bend the entire century. Think for a moment about what did not happen because of those two words. Without a communist Cuba, there is no reason to ship Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida. And so the 13 days of October 1962, the days the world held its breath, simply never dawn. Khrushchev keeps the rockets at home. Kennedy governs without the shadow of near annihilation, and perhaps without the hardened, war-tested instincts that shaped everything after. The Latin American left loses its brightest example. Moscow's dream of exporting revolution across the Andes cools. The exile community that in our world reshaped Miami instead sails home to rebuild Havana, and the embargo that starved the island for 6 decades is never written. A generation of guerrillas, from Nicaragua to Angola, grows up without the Cuban trainers, the Cuban rifles, the Cuban doctors and soldiers who followed. Whole wars are unfought, whole songs are unsung. All of it hinging on 16 bombers and a president who, this once, did not lose his nerve. If you had one Cold War flashpoint you could erase from history, drop it in the comments and tell me whether you'd hit like and subscribe for more of these unraveling timelines.